You can give someone your absolute loyalty, your precious time, your infinite patience, and even your sense of self-worth, and still find yourself treated as if you are completely replaceable, entirely disposable, and easily overlooked. When that harsh reality finally sets in, there is a very specific kind of emotional chain reaction that tends to unfold almost every single time. It does not happen randomly. It follows a distinct and predictable pattern. There are 6 quiet internal breakdowns that slowly wear down even the most generous and giving heart. Before we go any further into this, it is worth taking a moment for a very honest inner check. Have you ever noticed that the more effort you poured into someone, the less important and significant you started to feel in their presence? If that simple question strikes something uncomfortable or familiar deep within you, please know that you are far from alone. What follows may finally give clear words to something you have felt very deeply, but have struggled to properly define or explain to yourself until now. When a person enters into a relationship with a deeply giving mindset, they often offer consistent care, emotional presence, genuine understanding, endless forgiveness, quiet patience, and at times even self-neglect just to maintain the connection. Their way of loving is rooted in endurance and consistent effort, where emotional investment becomes a profound form of devotion. In the early phases, a person with narcissistic leanings may respond very strongly to this kind of absolute devotion. It can feel exciting to them, even intoxicating, because it provides constant attention, a steady stream of emotional supply, validation, and a sense of being the center of your universe. However, as time progresses, an internal shift slowly begins within the dynamic. What once felt special and unique starts to become familiar. And what becomes overly familiar often begins to lose its perceived value in their eyes. The giver, meanwhile, does not reduce their effort at all. Instead, they often increase it significantly. They try to understand more, accommodate more, explain more, and fix more, all while operating under the hopeful belief that if they just love harder, things will eventually stabilize and return to a state of harmony. But rather than restoring any real balance, this growing imbalance creates a subtle psychological distortion. One side becomes the constant provider, and the other side becomes the constant receiver. Gradually, the emotional labor you perform starts to disappear into the background. It is always there, always available, and because of that unwavering consistency, it stops being consciously acknowledged by the other person. At the same time, individuals with narcissistic patterns often struggle with the mechanics of sustained emotional reciprocity. Vulnerability that does not serve their specific self-image can feel threatening or uncomfortable to them, which may lead them to pull away emotionally, seek out control, or shift toward interactions based on admiration instead of genuine mutual exchange. As a result, your steady generosity is not always reflected back to you in equal emotional depth. Instead of being met with shared presence, it may be met with entitlement, emotional distance, or only very selective engagement. The relationship gradually becomes centered entirely around what is being received rather than what is being mutually built by both people. Over time, the giver begins to sense this imbalance, but instead of attributing it to the dynamic itself, they often turn inward and assume it must be their own fault. This leads them to try even harder. They overextend themselves emotionally in a desperate attempt to repair a connection that is already structurally uneven. This is how emotional exhaustion begins to replace emotional safety, slowly and almost invisibly. Love starts to feel less like a mutual connection and more like a continuous maintenance project performed by one person alone. After the initial phase of idealization, where the giver was viewed through a highly positive and admiring lens, there often comes a subtle transition. The emotional atmosphere begins to shift in a way that is not always immediately obvious. The very same traits that were once praised, such as your loyalty, your warmth, your patience, and your willingness to understand, may slowly begin to be reframed or interpreted in a more dismissive tone. This change is rarely dramatic at first. It often appears through small comments, slight changes in tone, minor criticisms, or behavioral inconsistencies that leave you feeling slightly unsettled, but unsure whether the situation is serious enough to confront. What makes this stage particularly confusing is the emotional contrast with what came before. You are still mentally holding on to the earlier intensity, the feeling of being valued, chosen, and deeply appreciated. So, when devaluation begins, your mind tries hard to reconcile these two conflicting realities. You may start questioning yourself, wondering if you did something wrong, or believing that if you just adjust your behavior a little more carefully, you can bring back the earlier version of the relationship. This creates a cycle of constant self-monitoring, where you become increasingly cautious about your tone, your responses, your expressions, and even your emotions. At this point, criticism is often delivered in a way that does not feel openly aggressive. It may be disguised as concern, disappointment, or emotional frustration, which makes it much harder for you to identify as genuine emotional erosion. Over time, you begin to feel as though your natural self is either too much or not enough, depending on the specific moment. You start reducing parts of your personality without even consciously realizing it, simply to avoid disapproval or emotional withdrawal from the other person. Internally, this creates a constant state of tension. You are still trying to regain the warmth that once felt effortless, but the conditions seem to keep changing. No matter how much you adjust, there is always another expectation, another issue, or another perceived flaw being highlighted. This ongoing instability does not just affect how you see the relationship. It slowly begins to reshape how you see yourself. Eventually, love starts to feel linked with correction rather than acceptance. When your emotional reality is repeatedly questioned in such a dynamic, a deeper psychological instability begins to form. At first, it may not look like outright denial. Instead, it often appears in subtle contradictions, dismissive responses, or reinterpretations of events that make you pause and question your own memory. You remember something clearly, but you are told it did not happen that way. You express how something felt, but you are told you are overreacting, misunderstanding, or exaggerating. Over time, this creates a growing distance between what you experienced internally and what you are being told externally is the truth. That gap becomes mentally exhausting. Human perception relies heavily on external feedback, especially within our closest relationships, to help validate our internal reality. When that feedback becomes inconsistent or invalidating, the natural human response is to turn inward and assume the issue lies within yourself. You begin questioning your memory, your emotional intensity, your interpretation of events, even when your internal experience feels undeniably real. This is where self-doubt begins to take root, not suddenly, but gradually, like erosion over a long period of time. As it continues, you may start adjusting how you communicate. You soften your concerns, avoid certain topics, or mentally rehearse your reactions before expressing them. Not because your perception has changed, but because being told you are wrong has become too emotionally draining to bear. Eventually, you begin to rely more on the other person's version of reality than your own inner sense, even when something feels completely off. Your internal compass becomes less trusted. Feelings that once served as clear signals of discomfort or misalignment start to feel uncertain, as though they need external approval to be valid. Step by step, this leads to a disconnection from your own emotional clarity. You still feel things deeply, but you stop fully trusting what those feelings mean. Instead of using your emotions as reliable guidance, you begin treating them as questionable data, something to second guess rather than something to understand. And this deepens the confusion further, keeping you trapped in a cycle of trying to get it right within a reality that keeps subtly shifting underneath you. Emotional exhaustion in this kind of relational pattern does not appear all at once. It builds slowly through continuous, invisible effort and through constant internal processing that others may never even notice. It builds until one day you realize you have been carrying far more than you ever consciously agreed to carry. The person who has given everything often begins to function in a state of ongoing emotional labor where they are not only handling their own internal feelings, but also constantly regulating and managing the emotional atmosphere of the relationship itself. This involves silently predicting reactions before they happen, trying to prevent disagreements from forming, quickly repairing any misunderstanding that appears, and continuously reshaping their own emotional responses so that tension does not escalate or lead to withdrawal from the other side. Over time, this becomes less of a conscious choice and more of an automatic survival pattern. Gradually, this turns into a pattern of over-functioning, where the individual slowly assumes responsibility for emotional stability within the relationship, even when that responsibility is not equally shared or acknowledged by the other person. They may find themselves repeatedly clarifying their intentions just to be understood, offering apologies not necessarily because they are wrong, but because it restores a sense of connection, or carefully reframing situations in ways that maintain peace and prevent emotional distance. On the outside, this behavior can be mistaken for emotional maturity, patience, or deep commitment. Yet, internally, it often feels like a constant monitoring of self, a state of hyper-alertness where nothing can be left unexamined. What makes this pattern especially draining is not just the effort itself, but the lack of stable resolution that follows it. Instead of reaching a secure emotional ground where things feel settled, the situation keeps shifting in unpredictable ways. What seemed to work in one moment loses its effectiveness in the next. What was considered acceptable behavior at one point suddenly becomes a major issue later without any clear explanation. This inconsistency creates an emotional instability that forces the mind into continuous analysis, constantly trying to decode what version of behavior, tone, or expression will finally create the consistency and safety you crave. You find yourself exhausted by the need to navigate a terrain that refuses to stay still, constantly worried that the ground beneath you will vanish again. This is the weight of being the only one holding the relationship together while being told the instability is entirely your doing. It is a slow, silent process, but recognizing it is the first, most vital step toward reclaiming your own truth and your own peace. Over time, this ongoing process of mental adjustment becomes truly exhausting, affecting you not just on an emotional level, but physically as well. As this cycle continues to repeat, both your mind and your body begin to register a deep, persistent kind of fatigue. This emotional weight builds up so gradually, sometimes in such a subtle way, that you only really notice it when your natural motivation begins to fade, or when the simple act of self-expression starts to feel significantly heavier than it used to. You may begin to feel increasingly disconnected from your own inner needs because your priority has shifted almost entirely toward maintaining harmony in the relationship at any cost. Even those moments that should feel restful and restorative no longer offer you true peace. This is because a significant part of your mind remains occupied with unresolved tension, constantly replaying past interactions, interpreting hidden meanings, and nervously anticipating what might come next. Rest becomes incomplete, as if your nervous system never fully manages to power down. Eventually, this emotional exhaustion is no longer just about feeling tired or overwhelmed. It evolves into a much deeper state, where even simple emotional expression starts to feel like a monumental effort. Your natural spontaneity begins to disappear, replaced by a careful, cautious calculation of every word you speak and every reaction you show. A sense of inner ease becomes harder and harder to access, as if the emotional space you occupy within yourself has steadily narrowed over time. If this resonates with you even slightly, it becomes incredibly important to pause internally and reflect on which stages of this process feel familiar in your own lived experience. Simply becoming aware of these patterns begins to interrupt the automatic nature of the cycle. Awareness is far more than just intellectual understanding. It acts as the very first real boundary that begins to form within the self. And if there is a willingness to explore this further, it becomes possible to understand how you can begin to detach from this cycle without needing to force an emotional shutdown or a complete cold withdrawal from the relationship. In many cases, what looks like emotional isolation does not begin in any dramatic or obvious way. It develops gradually, almost invisibly, which makes it very difficult to recognize while it is actually happening. It rarely starts with any clear instruction to disconnect from others. Instead, it begins through subtle internal shifts in your attention, your emotional investment, and the overall sense of safety you experience in your relationships with the outside world. As your emotional focus becomes increasingly centered on managing that one primary relationship, other areas of your life, such as your friendships, your interactions with family, and your wider social engagements, slowly begin to feel more demanding. This is not necessarily because those relationships themselves have changed, but because your internal emotional capacity has become so limited. When so much of your energy is continuously spent on trying to understand, repair, and stabilize one central emotional bond, there is naturally very little energy left over for other forms of connection. As a result, interactions that once felt effortless and refreshing may begin to feel like draining obligations rather than sources of relief or enjoyment. Over time, a quiet social withdrawal can begin to form in very subtle ways. Plans may be cancelled more frequently, not always because you lack the desire to be around people, but simply because you are suffering from profound emotional exhaustion. Conversations may feel much harder to engage in, especially when there is an underlying sense of confusion that is difficult to explain to others. There can be an increasing tendency to avoid social interaction entirely because it feels too draining to present a normal, happy external self while you are internally carrying complex emotional burdens that feel entirely unresolved. This creates a quiet, lonely separation between your inner experience and your outward behavior. At the same time, there are often relational dynamics that reinforce this narrowing of your social world. Your external relationships may start to feel less relevant, less important, or even emotionally risky to maintain. In some cases, your outside connections are subtly questioned in your own mind, minimized in their importance, or viewed as distractions from your primary emotional focus. You may begin to feel that others would not fully understand your situation, or that trying to explain it would require too much effort, or might even lead to further misunderstandings. There can also be a deep, internal sense that discussing the details of your situation outside the relationship might feel like a form of disloyalty, or that it would be inappropriate to share. This happens even when no one has ever explicitly suggested that you should keep these things to yourself. This creates a quiet but incredibly powerful internal justification for pulling back from your social connections, even in the complete absence of any external pressure. As this process continues, your isolation becomes more structured. The relationship gradually becomes the central, and sometimes the only, emotional reference point you have. This increases your emotional dependency, not necessarily through force or direct control, but through the gradual reduction of alternative emotional inputs. Without the benefit of regular, external perspectives, it becomes increasingly difficult for you to reality check your experiences or recognize patterns that might otherwise be much more visible from an outside point of view. Slowly, your entire emotional world begins to shrink. You may still be physically surrounded by other people, but emotionally, fewer and fewer voices are influencing your sense of reality. This creates a narrowing of perspective, where the relationship begins to feel larger and more central than everything else in your life, even when it is also the primary source of your emotional confusion or distress. Over time, this intensified focus makes the relational dynamic feel all-consuming, as if it defines the entire emotional climate of your inner world. Eventually, a final stage begins to form, and this stage often carries the most psychological weight because it represents a total breaking point in the internal system you have been trying to maintain for so long. After repeated cycles of idealization, emotional devaluation, self-doubt, exhaustion, and withdrawal, something begins to fundamentally shift in the way you process reality. Your mind reaches a point where it can no longer reconcile the massive amount of emotional effort you are investing with the meager level of emotional return you are receiving. This imbalance becomes increasingly difficult to organize mentally. This creates a rising internal pressure that eventually exceeds the system's capacity to adapt in its previous habitual way. In some individuals, this manifests as a state of emotional burnout, where both your emotional and physical systems begin to shut down as a necessary protective response to prolonged, severe stress. Emotional reactions that once felt intense or immediate may begin to feel muted, distant, or less accessible to you. The ongoing effort to fix, repair, or stabilize the relationship begins to lose its sense of urgency. This is not because the situation has actually improved, but because your nervous system has reached a critical threshold where continued emotional engagement feels completely unsustainable. There is often a noticeable sense of numbness at this stage, which can be very confusing because it does not always reflect a true absence of feeling. Instead, it reflects an overwhelmed internal system that can no longer process high levels of emotional intensity in the same way. It is as if your mind temporarily reduces its sensitivity in order to protect you from further overload. For others, the shift does not come as a sense of numbness, but as a sudden, sharp clarity. This change is often gradual rather than sudden. It appears as a slow reorganization of your perception, where the very same patterns that once felt deeply confusing begin to appear much more consistent and recognizable. The contradictions that previously required you to provide constant justifications or complex emotional explanations begin to stand out more clearly. The overall dynamic starts to feel less like a complicated mystery and more like a repeating structure that simply does not change, regardless of how much effort or adjustment you apply. At this point, what you once felt was a personal failure or a simple misunderstanding may begin to be understood as a consistent, unhealthy relational pattern that persists no matter how much of yourself you invest. This recognition can be deeply destabilizing because it challenges the long-held belief that if you just provided more understanding, more patience, or more emotional work, you would eventually create a sense of balance. Instead, there is often a painful, crushing realization that the imbalance was never temporary, never accidental, and never easily correctable, but was actually something much more structural and permanent in nature.